I'm Janet Jacobson, and I'm the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I have some remarks to get through here, people. All right, but you should clap after this next sentence, too. I'd like to welcome you to the 5th annual BCRW Salon, this one in honor of Christina Crosby's forthcoming book, A Body, Undone, Living On After Great Pain, to be published by NYU Press in the Sexual Cultures series. Christina Crosby is professor of feminist gender and sexuality studies and English at Wesleyan University. She's the author of The Ends of History, Victorians and the Woman Question. The book that we are celebrating this evening, A Body, Undone, is a memoir of living with disability that grapples with the physical deficits of quadriplegia encountered at age 50. The book explores how feminist and queer commitments can make possible a livable life in and with a body that remains perpetually undone. I'd like to thank a number of people for making this evening possible. First of all, as always, the entire staff of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, including Ann Jonas and Pamela Phillips, for their immense organizational skills, as well as Hope Dector and Nietzsche Yin for helping to get the word out. Also, many members of the Barnard community and Columbia community, especially Rachel Adams, who has run a group for the Center for the Study of Social Difference on disability studies for several years now, and has helped to really build it here on campus and where an early version of this work was heard. I'd also like to thank the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at NYU, which co-sponsored this evening's events. This is also the moment at which I announce future events at BCRW. I'll say a few more words by way of introduction, by the way, then Christina will read, and I'll introduce each of the panelists in advance, and then we'll just go right into their responses and then discussion with all of you. So our upcoming events are not that many, but each and every one is a blockbuster, so I have to mention them all. You'll see what I mean. On March 24th, our annual Women's History Month lecture will be offered by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Annette Gordon-Reed. You'll also know this lecture, for those of you who are in the Barnard community, was promoted by the historians on the BCRW Advisory Board. They wanted to know why in March we had Women's History Month and yet we didn't have a lecture on history. And they in fact hit the table when impressing upon us the need to have one in history. And this year it will be in honor of our retiring colleague and longtime BCRW board member, longer than I've been director, Herbert Sloan. So I hope you can come out for that. And finally, we've decided to turn the lecture into one in honor of our colleague, Natalie Boymel-Campen. So it will be the first annual Natalie Campen lecture in literature and history, criticism and history. All right, then on April 16th, novelist Jamaica Kincaid will be in conversation with the writer Tiffany Yannick and our colleague Kayama Glover in the first of a series on Caribbean women writers that is organized by our new Associate Director, Tammy Navarro. So please come out for that. And on April 23rd, our colleague in English, Rachel Eisendrath, will offer a lunchtime lecture downstairs in the BCRW library on the history of the ugly. For those of you who have read Susan Shrike's book on the ugly laws, the intertwining of disability studies and the question of beauty and morality is one that is central to disability studies, so please come back for that. And then finally, on May 1st, we are hosting a symposium on activist research. As many of you know, this is my final semester as director of BCRW. Our fabulous colleague, Tina Campt, will be taking over this summer, about which I am very glad. And the May 1st symposium will be a chance to look at my time as director and will include many of our collaborators over the course of the past 15 years. So I do hope you will come out for that. I have to admit that I have had some trouble, and I seem to be having some trouble this evening, announcing this symposium because I do in fact have trouble promoting an event that centers on my own work. But as always, the faithful staff of the BCRW, who has no fear of saying what they think, said, I must announce it, and then Hope Dector, brilliant as she is, said that it is my job to announce it, and she knows that there is no quicker way to get me to do anything than to say, it is my job. And in fact, I owe a debt of gratitude to the entire staff for being here this evening. As many of you know, Christina Crosby, whose book we honor this evening, also happens to be my partner in life. And I've been hesitant to ask her to participate in events here at BCRW for fear of intertwining personal and professional relationships. I used to teach at the University of Arizona, and we ran a series called Sex and Scholarship, and I was in charge of it one year, and Christina wanted to know why I was not inviting her, pointing out that I was interested in her contributions to both of these fields. And I said, you can invite your girlfriend, but the staff felt, they heard the early version of this work at Rachel's workshop, and they felt that it was an important thing to do, and it was important to add to what we've done here on disability studies, which we probably have not done enough, in part because of my own hesitancy. I will also note that there is a character named Janet in the book that you will hear. But I have the good fortune to have spent enough time with literary critics, many of them on this panel, to know that the character Janet is not me. And given these distinctions and given the strong arguments that the staff made about what the book can do, I'm very, very glad that we're here this evening. I also just want to note that this is the fifth in the series of salons that feature either forthcoming or recently published work in feminist studies. We began the first in the spring of 2011 in anticipation of the publication of Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism, with a conversation that featured Lauren as well as virtually the entire editorial staff of the Sexual Culture series. And it was a very, very meaningful event, and so we decided to do it again, and it has included Carla Holloway's Public Bodies, Private Text, Tanika Sarkar's work on religion and secularity, and Janet Mock's last year, a wonderful symposium on Janet Mock's redefining realness, all of which take into account various negotiations around questions of public and private, the very ones I've had to negotiate before you just now. They make clear the continuing import of bringing multiple stories about private lives into public conversation. I think there's also a good chance the book that the initial salon that we did was with Lauren was based out of a project that she and I had done early on in my time at BCRW called Feminism Unfinished, out of which she had built a series of projects on public feelings. And I do want to note that there is some possibility that you will see public feelings this evening. Even though I know the character Janet is not me, I do cry each and every time Christina reads from this material. But more importantly, our panelists are, in addition to being distinguished memoirists, writers, critics themselves, they are also Christina's current and former colleagues, her former students. These colleagues in good and queer fashion overlap in unexpected and happy ways. And some of our panelists met Christina first through her writing, but because Christina is the person that she is, they too have become her friends and colleagues. They are also experts in different ways on the type of writing that we're here to discuss this evening. They've written memoirs themselves, they do critical work on life writing and or queer studies and or disability studies. Again, the categories interlap and interweave. And many of them either read or helped to form early versions of the manuscript. I'm now going to introduce each of them in alphabetical order, the order in which they will speak. Very briefly, they have much longer bios, all of them. Lisa Cohen teaches at Wesleyan University and is the author of All We Know, 3 Lives, which received notice as a best book in 2013 from the New York Times and Publishers Weekly, among others, and was nominated for a National Critics Circle Award. Leigh Gilmore is a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School and is the author of many books and articles on life writing, including Autobiographics, A Feminist Theory of Women's Self-Representation, and another, The Limits of Autobiography and Trauma and Testimony. And she has a forthcoming book from Columbia University Press called Tainted Witness. Laura Grappo teaches at Wesleyan University and is currently writing a book called Home and Other Myths, A Lexicon of Queer Inhabitations. Maggie Nelson teaches at California Institute of the Arts. She writes poetry and prose, including Jane, A Murder, The Red Parts, Bluets, The Art of Cruelty, and the soon-to-be-published The Argonauts. Gayle Pemberton teaches at Mount Holyoke College and is the author of The Hottest Water in Chicago. And then finally, Gayle Salamon teaches at Princeton University and is the author of Assuming a Body, Transgender and Rhetorics of Materiality, which received a Lambda Literary Award in 2010. Before I turn to Christina for her reading, I'd just like to say that while the material in Christina's book is highly personal, I also think it has extensive political implications in good feminist terms. It has implications for disability studies and disability justice, for feminism, for the possibility of queer lives. And even more than that, I can say that each and every word of this book is true. Christina Crosby.
I'm very honored to be here this evening, and I thank each of you for coming. I thank the Barnard Center for Research on Women for hosting this event, and my heart is full. I'm going to read from the first essay that you encounter in the book. It's entitled, Your Puny, Vulnerable Self. And I will begin with words from Emily Dickinson. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet mechanical grow round, a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. I find that Emily Dickinson is right. In the wake of great pain, the pulse of life slows, and the interval between life-sustaining beats interminably extends. Life is suspended in that interval. The difference between the one you once were and the one you have become must be addressed, the pain acknowledged, and the grief admitted. It can be a treacherous process, given all that might be lost. Can you help me here? Thanks. In the months after the accident, as I lay in my hospital bed unmoving, and in a firestorm of neurological pain, I many times wished I had died at the instant my chin struck the pavement. I broke my neck in a bicycling accident. Had it not been for Janet, my dear lover, this wish would, I believe, have gathered darkness around it, enough to become an active desire for death. This is not to say that I live for her. What a weaseling evasion that would be, and a truly impossible burden to foist on one I love so dearly. Janet, whose life was intertwined with mine before the accident, made it clear from the beginning that she desires me and desires my touch. I'm your physical lover. She said it to me in the hospital, and she meant it. She is infinitely precious to me. Yet I know that I need more if my life is to be truly livable. Those first 2 years after the accident, as I recovered and reoriented myself, I was especially in need of the love of my friends, and I'm deeply grateful that so many people gave so freely of their time and attention. I wish I could have similarly helped and sheltered my brother, who was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in his late 20s. Voice recognition technology, exactly what I'm using to write at this moment, allowed him to keep working as a lawyer, even as his body became ever less functional. He had the support of his law practice. All the people there helped him work far, far longer than he would have been able to without their help. MS finally forced his retirement when he was 49 years old. Over the decades, my mind veered away from imagining his home life with his wife Beth and their children, Kirsten and Colin, as the disease undermined his capacities. It's complicated, as family stories always are. As he came into adulthood, his life flowed into familiar religious and familial channels. Mine did not. I was never alienated from my family. We all loved one another dearly. But from my college days on, I needed to love at a distance. I suppose I feared being conscripted through my affections into obligations I'd quietly resent, while all around me enacted a family life that undid me in ways that it will take a lifetime to understand. So I kept my counsel and my distance and felt my difference. After my injury, as I lay in the hospital thinking about Jeff, I felt the strangeness of being on the other side of the looking glass. Suddenly, I was quadriplegic too, just like my brother. The odds against that doubling just beggared my imagination. It seemed a terrible and uncanny repetition of an intermittent childhood fantasy of mine. Jeff and I were born just 13 months apart, and when young, I could imagine myself as his twin. My childhood of play with Jeff was an intimation of gender's pleasurable malleability, even as I felt the pinch of its reductive strictures. When we reached junior high, that theater of puberty, where gender's normative powers are enthusiastically enforced, I suffered as only a 13-year-old girl, unable to master femininity, can suffer. Jeff and I went our separate ways thenceforth into adulthood. Then came his diagnosis and slow but implacable paralysis. In our middle age, I joined him in quadriplegia. In this account, I represent much that takes place behind closed doors and draw back the curtain behind which the chronic pain and dependence created by damage to the central nervous system are managed. Revelations that may carry the whiff of the apocalyptic. My straightforward discussion of moving paralyzed bowels, for example, where I lay out the protocol necessary to both Jeff's life and mine, thus representing the fundamentals of the fundament, diving into the wreck of my body. I have no wish to embarrass myself or mortify you, but I do believe that living in extremis can clarify what is often obscure, in this case, the fragility of our beautiful bodies and the dependencies of all human being. Thank you. I started writing this book to create something from an otherwise confounded life. Only through writing have I arrived at the life I now lead, the body I now am. I've done this work in language because my profession is the study of literature. It's what I have and what I know. I have found solace in tropes, since figurative language helps us approach what's otherwise unapproachable or incommunicable. Emily Dickinson writes, after great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. This is the hour of lead. I begin in that leaden place where pain seems on the other side of language and work towards living on. Thank you. Thank you.
Where am I? How am I? When will it stop? It will not stop. What becomes of myself, and how can I know it? The questions are linguistic, spatial, affective, temporal, and epistemological. They are also, importantly, questions of genre. What is self-portraiture, Christina is asking, in the face of a self one cannot and does not want to recognize? My skepticism about myself, she writes, is not only that of the intellectual taught to be suspicious of such a clearly bounded rationality, but also an inability to recognize who I have become. This book is a complex investigation of recognition in all of its forms. In line with Christina's definitional and etymological spirit, I will note that to recognize is to know again, a feat of repeated cognition. It is to perceive something or someone to be the same as what was previously known. It is to identify and to acknowledge the existence or validity of. It is to grant a right to speak and to give some token of thanks. It is to assent. Writing with and against the genre of memoir, Christina is performing acts of recognition, but often not of assent. That is, recognition of Janet's love, of her friends' help and care, of the unjust labor conditions of care workers, of the fact that this work deserves to be recognized more equitably. In the professional structure she is partly formed by, she had, before the stick became lodged in the spokes of her bike, and everything that followed, she had just become chair of the faculty, the person who recognizes her peers, granting them the power to speak to that collective body. If to recognize is to accept a state's independence, what I'd call an act of geopolitical condescension, but that's another story, Christina is writing about accepting and not accepting the states of dependence that we all experience at one time or another. But she's also insisting on refusal, writing about not desiring acceptance. To return to genre. Memoirs tend to traffic in questions of candor and reticence, of what or how much can I say. But this book turns more interestingly to epistemological questions. I don't just mean the impasses of what my body can't know, as she puts it. I mean that she writes about what she herself didn't want to know, was afraid to know, came to know, about her life and her brother's and that of others. Crucially, these questions are not framed here as the heroics of compassion. Instead, they might be understood as a struggle with the tyranny and productivity of what Eve Sedgwick called so succinctly the privilege of unknowing. This privilege and its power, all of the ways that it operates in the world. I don't want to know, I don't want to hear it, we sometimes say, but that is the conscious version. I mean that Christina's work to clarify what is often obscure gets up in the face of a few of those unconscious forms of unknowing, the privilege that is so all-encompassing that it is mostly invisible to those who wield it, that it seldom even has to acknowledge itself as privilege. The subtle temporal troubles she writes about are one way of disturbing that unknowing. Time lost, not regained, yet retained. The quotidian recognized as off-kilter. Uncanny returns, or the particular fold in time I felt myself to be living in, a doubling back, terribly changed to days long ago. The endless freshness of grief, the notion of permanent mourning, the time pressures on the people who labor on her behalf in the hospital, her own drugged and slowed down time, the chronologically sequential time moving toward a knowable future of literary realism versus the fear of the erosion of embodied memory, and even more horrific fear of my insistent, unforgettable future, countered by the ever-repeated present of dog time. The ways our bodies both have and are a history. All of these bring me to writing time. The life and body experienced as beyond the reach of language are often articulated here not just in acts of definition and of necessary and inadequate figuration, even catachresis, but through repetition. The manuscript is marked by reiterative cries. It burns, she writes. I used to be so strong. I used to be so strong. And thank you, I said to everyone, thank you. This account, which I've watched grow over several years, this long labor of composition, revision, even recognition, what I witnessed was also Christina's pleasure in it. Of course, in my readings of the book and in her reports on its progress, what I saw were often self-discoveries. I also saw her ascent to a writing self that is the same as and yet different from the one she'd known before the accident. This is a fact, and one to lay alongside the affective intensities and impossibilities of the horror story inhabited in real life and all of the other conversations between fact and fiction that she so beautifully animates in this book.
Pain is a 21st century problem with a long backstory. It represents across time, place, status, and language a record of suspended animation. As Christina writes early in A Body Undone, in the wake of great pain, the pulse of life slows, and the interval between life-sustaining beats interminably extends. Life is suspended. In that interval, the difference between the one you once were and the one you have become must be addressed, the pain acknowledged, and the grief admitted. Pain currently affects 100 million Americans. Making pain countable means tracking prescriptions of opioid medicines, logging lost productivity, and recording the duration of treatment in rehabilitation facilities. Making pain countable is one means by which to hold workplaces, state services, and healthcare systems accountable to it. Christina Crosby's graceful and gripping memoir belongs to an increasing number of personal accounts of living with pain that point the way toward another accounting, a reckoning really, in the face of our singular and shared precarity. Christina challenges and galvanizes our sense that just as there are catastrophes one must live through and with that one cannot imagine, there are also relations of care that exceed all counting. Witness Janet. The growing body of autobiographical narratives on the subject of pain augments the numerous studies of pain from medical and policy perspectives because pain is expensive, and a considerable amount of this life writing hews to conventions of hope and overcoming and links pain to affects like optimism and resilience. Many of these memoirs are self-published and or directed to specific communities. Some are celebrity-authored bestsellers. Their titles suggest a narrowing in which the new experiences of pain and disability are forced into older models of individualistic overcoming. Think of the two memoirs of quadriplegia by American actor Christopher Reeve, Still Me and Nothing is Impossible, that lean on a can-do American spirit. The actor Michael J. Fox's Lucky Man and Always Looking Up describe his life with Parkinson's disease and are also exemplary of this genre. This is the kind of memoir Christina explicitly chooses not to write. of the, quote, happy idea that disability leads to profound insight or higher understanding, despite the narrative arc that organizes so many stories about living with disability, which carries the narrator to livable accommodations and lessons learned, Christina writes, don't believe it. A Body Undone belongs to a different strand of autobiographical narrative about chronic pain, much of which is currently being written by middle-aged women who are professional writers, poets, essayists, and academics. They write about headache, Joan Didion, Joyce Carol Oates, and new work by Sally Tisdale, about accidents, injury, rehabilitation, and pain management. They write about catastrophic flukes, like environmental writer Gretel Ehrlich's account of being struck by lightning and its aftermath, of undiagnosed or misdiagnosed illness, of illness that resists diagnosis. Megan O'Rourke, for example, is writing about chronic pain and her own mysterious autoimmune disease. And they write as feminists, and from the experience of queering everything else that matters, and so why not also pain, the uninvited fellow traveler to whom they are bound for the long haul. In Facing Pain and Altered Embodiment, Christina joins Adrienne Rich, who so memorably acknowledged pain as her central problem in Your Native Land, Your Life. After decades of suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, Rich posed the question of how to live in a damaged body, how to see the world's damage from this vantage point and live on. If pain is a 21st century problem with a long backstory, it now has a feminist voice that does something other than tack doggedly from victimhood to triumphalism. It has a voice that asks, what difference does a specific kind of writing make to understandings of pain? From her memoir's braided narrative structure to the lesbian feminist academic knowledges it wields, A Body Undone claims that as surely as language structures reality, writing about pain can make it more livable. In this effort, A Body Undone twins pain's time and pain's body to register the dual griefs of losing a beloved body and the life associated with it. Let me pause to say the obvious here. Time, the body, pain, and language are big topics in life writing. For now, I simply want to mark out gratefully Christina's innovation in leveraging language about affect and the body toward new understandings of pain and grief. Notice how embodied are our metaphors of affect and moral fiber. Having a thick skin means being overly sensitive. Having a thin skin means being overly sensitive. The boundary of the self figured by a thin skin is endangered because it cannot slough off mere aggressions. Having a thick skin means that through a certain inuring to force over time, one overshoots equanimity and lands in toughness. Skin, thick and thin, figures affect, a way of touching the world, of feeling one's way in relation to others. Skin shorthands self. Christina's skin now covers her body with pain's touch, neoprene-like, she describes it, her skin a wetsuit of electrical impulses gone haywire. What is it like to feel the self and the world through this skin? In relation to this skinscape across which rages a firestone of damaged neurological effects, Christina introduces the past sexual skin of the leather pants. They appear early as memory and figure of loss. Gone, she writes, is the affect of feeling sexy in leather pants and silver jewelry. But the leather pants as sexual skin also potently recall sexy Professor Christina. They recur in the memorable words of the Wesleyan chalkers, whose campus sidewalk encomium declares, "Christina Crosby's leather pants make me wet." Thank you for laughing there. The sexual skin they evoke represents the imaginative labor and material practices of visualizing the social fact of lesbian life. Thick-skinned and thin-skinned are inherited figural language. The sexual skin of leathered pants is remembered and put into this account of a lesbian life. And the neoprene skin, the wet suit of pain that encases the body, is a new material and figural body in the discourse of pain. Christina's elaboration of electrical storms raking her body into wild space is unlike anything I have read. Time is a bit of a problem in life writing. Memoir needs retrospection, a view of the past. Christina's handling of retrospection is one of the great narrative strengths of her memoir. She has selected strands of experience to braid into the presentation of a knowing subject. The stories knit and compel. She uses the device of twinning to induce narrative cohesion in the face of the chances of life. But a shared feature of chronic pain memoirs is that they pivot from retrospection to prospection, from the autobiographer's question, who am I and how did I become who I am, to the pain memoirists, how will who I was help or hinder me to live on? Who am I now? Whom shall I become? This oscillation of retro and prospection requires that memoirists orient themselves and readers on a new map of consciousness and experience. In A Body Undone, after and with form the temporal coordinates of pain. Lost in space is its location. Written against romantic time, A Body Undone is written instead in the time of post-trauma, of living after and living with pain, after, with. How does one live into the future after the body is undone? I would say that after reading A Body Undone, that being a lesbian, feminist, academic, motorcycle-riding hottie in one of literary memoir's most potent and regenerative love stories is probably the best preparation one could have. My current work at Harvard Divinity School on chronic pain memoirs links current writing like Christina's to the medieval women mystics. So you can see why I began my remarks by saying pain is a 21st century problem with a long backstory. But can you imagine my joy at encountering Saint Christina the Astonishing and her miraculous nipples on page 128? I hope I'm not giving too much away, but during phone sex, Janet says to Christina, you know, you're like Saint Christina the Astonishing. She's a 12th century Belgian whose miraculous breast saved her when she was hiding from her persecutors in the wilderness. She was a virgin, she was starving, and her breast gave her milk. Some say olive oil. Astonishing, but she's got nothing on you, baby. In her unfolding of this anecdote into a meditation on moving through the world with her body, of, as she writes, feeling my way, often with great pleasure and always by touch, Christina Crosby writes in present tense, I'm no saint, but when it comes to nipples, I am most certainly Christina the Astonishing. The medieval mystics' sense of life and time, of the body and gender, take pain and suffering as complex material for knowing God and the self. Religious studies and feminist scholar Amy Hollywood in Acute Melancholia comments on how the mystics help us to engage with the implacability of grief and our inability to ever fully let go of the ones we love. She writes, if we are lucky, the others we refuse to lose enable us to live. And citing Freud, that without love there is no grief, and without grief there is no love. A Body Undone tells the story of love and loss when the other we grieve is the body, a form, a fact, a force, and a figure that nonetheless still offers life and love.
Hi, everybody. When I first imagined what I might say today, I thought I would approach Christina's book as I might any other text. Like most scholars, I imagine, I hope to say something thoughtful and intellectually challenging and critically astute. I was going to refer to a whole host of related texts describing the book in relation to the fields of disability studies and contemporary queer memoir. I was going to argue what I hoped were sophisticated points that would link the study of memory to theories of trauma and then add in a dose of gender theory for good measure. And then I read the book. And the book does surely contribute to disability studies scholarship, as well as work on pain, trauma, and loss. Yet, for me, this contribution was secondary to the powerful and deeply visceral level at which the book affected me. This is a profoundly honest and deeply courageous book, the sort of work that can't be done justice through abstraction. As such, I'd like to use my time today to reflect upon a couple of themes that were, for me, especially compelling. So to begin, number one, I'd like to consider the words humility, simplicity, and service to others. These are the words Christina uses to describe the major tenets of the Brethren faith, her familial childhood faith. We learned that her parents instilled these virtues, and we are told that they lived on in her brother Jeff, who remained part of the church and looked to embody these qualities. Jeff, while facing progressive MS and bodily deterioration, manages to turn his suffering into an opportunity to serve others. He envisions asking for help as a gift to the one who offers assistance, an opportunity to allow a stranger to produce an act of kindness and to feel the pleasure of bettering the life of a fellow human being. Despite attempts to leave the Brethren faith behind, Christina, of course, acknowledges that you can't leave behind the values that have made you. Character cannot be cast off no matter how far away you go. Facing this truth, she explains, quote, "We can't choose our families of origin, and we can't choose our childhoods, so I have no choice but to be brethren. For better or worse, I am my parents' daughter," end quote. And it is through this resignation to absurdity, how in the world might the identities of radical lesbian feminists and brethren coalesce in one person? Humility, simplicity, and service to others. There is a clear and simple beauty to these words. In our current political and cultural atmosphere, one that rewards narcissism, brutality, and ever-increasing consumption, these words seem almost archaic, akin to vows of celibacy or refusing to eat meat on Fridays. These are words of kindness and of care, plain words that value community and respect, that demand the ego be kept in check. And as these words have shaped Christina, molded character, shored up ethics, indirectly, these words have changed my life for the better. You see, some years ago, I was a bewildered college freshman, newly arrived at Wesleyan University and randomly assigned to Christina as an advisee. Before classes began, Christina gathered her small group of freshman advisees to guide us through the course selection process. And that was when I began to freak out. A flop sweat, nausea, intense longings to run out the door and not stop till I crossed the New York state line. I was coming from a low-income Puerto Rican background. I might as well have been a Martian. My happily chatting classmates, aflutter with questions, were like no other teenagers I had ever met, confident and well-spoken. They described summer travel to places I had never heard of, and intentions to double major in both biology and philosophy, so as to assure med schools that they were well-rounded candidates. They blithely paged through course catalogs, circling with abandon, and soliciting opinions as to whether one's father could be convinced that psychology was a real science. One even suggested, on the grounds that she was already a published author, that she be allowed to skip the introductory course to the English major. Coming out of a broken school system that was deeply and virulently anti-intellectual, I was ill-prepared, and I knew it. My family had advised against going away to college. Too far, too expensive, too difficult. My love of books was seen not only as strange, but potentially harmful. My mother continuously cautioned against overindulgence, often proclaiming that reading too much will make a person crazy. This odd obsession with books, coupled with an intense curiosity about the world that seemed, even to me, an indication of my strangeness, and therefore somewhat shameful. Who was I to dream about studying beluga whales or to have an opinion on the value of the parliamentary system of government? I assumed such thoughts would be ridiculed, and perhaps rightly so, I felt. Who was I to explore and to research and to invent new ideas? Who was I? Christina was kind to me in that first meeting, patiently taking hours out of the day, and it was the day right before classes start. And as I am now a professor, I'm so sorry for doing that. To explain the workings of the course credit system, to try to get me to understand the difference between anthropology and sociology, and to try to get me to articulate some sort of academic interest that made sense. But it was a few weeks later, looking back, that I can pinpoint as one of those moments in which you're at a life crossroads. What happened was that I had reached my limit. I had a belly full of culture shock, and I wanted to go home, or at least someplace that made sense to me. I felt like one of those poor suckers trapped in the twilight zone. Everything was just a little bit off, but almost no one else seemed to notice. One fall afternoon, I marched into Christina's office, and without even taking a seat, I declared myself finished with Wesleyan and with all college. I demanded the proper paperwork to sign to submit my official withdrawal. And then I looked at Christina. Her eyes were compassionate, and she offered a friendly smile and calmly suggested that I sit down and talk my decision through with her. Face to face with her kindness, the wind was taken right out of my sails. I sat. We talked for a long time. I confided my alienation, my confusion, my fears that I would be unable to keep up academically. Humbly, compassionately, she listened to me. And she offered a sounding board, advice, the idea that I could and would stand the intellectual equal of any of my classmates. These meetings soon became a weekly occurrence. And at the end of each meeting, Christina would offer, "Let's just give it another week and see how you feel then." And I would, feeling comforted and inspired, I would agree to that sensible plan. By the beginning of the second semester, I had found good friends and comfortable social settings. And best of all, through Christina, my scholarly trepidation was slowly but steadily dissipating. I had stopped asking Christina about how to quit school and instead came to her with questions about what I was reading and for advice on how to work through particular ideas and authors. Even when politely and subtly correcting my atrocious grammar, she never once made me feel ashamed of these questions. And some were quite the doozy. I remember being super into a book that had been assigned for a class. It was a collection of Martin Luther's greatest hits. And I described it with great animation and detail until Christina, with only the smallest of smiles, assured me that she was familiar with the general overview. These meetings with Christina allowed me to feel like someone was watching my back, somebody who I could trust, not only with my scholarly ambitions, but perhaps much more importantly, I could trust to act with uncommon decency and humility, to treat even the rawest and most ill-hewn freshman with the fundamental respect all humans deserve. The following year, Christina directed me towards the Mellon Undergrad Minority Fellowship Program, a pre-doctoral program for students in ethnic and racial minority groups. The Mellon program benefited me greatly and helped prepare my path towards grad school and the professoriate. And now, many years later, I sit here as an assistant professor at the same institution I tried to quit long ago. If I had succeeded in doing so, if I had had an advisor who had not been molded and shaped by this brethren code that requires humility, simplicity, and service to others, my life would have been so different, perhaps unrecognizable to me now. And now, as I have students of my own to teach and advise, I try to embody these same principles. I guess the good news has been spread, if in an extremely unorthodox fashion. 2, the pain acknowledged and the grief admitted. This simple phrase, pain acknowledged, grief admitted, may seem a fairly obvious sentiment. How could one not acknowledge severe pain? How could one not grieve the loss of strength, mobility, independence? But to feel pain, to live pain, to be subject to the whims of pain is not the same as acknowledging it. Likewise, anger and sadness are not the same thing as admitting grief. Christina's description of pain and its various permutations was particularly moving for me because she captures the storm of emotions that accompany such pain with both a deft hand and a stark honesty. To my mind, pain can be distinguished into two major types. There's acute pain, the sort of pain we've all had: a broken arm, a scraped knee, stomach cramps, a kitchen burn, childbirth. This sort of pain certainly hurts, but it happens and then it is over. Once it is done, one may breathe easy and find comfort in its absence. Then there's another kind of pain, the permanent, ever-evolving, constant, insidious pain that accompanies chronic illness and severe injury. This sort of pain is altogether a different animal. This sort of pain can only truly be known from experience because this sort of pain is not only about aching bodies. Rather, this sort of pain inspires horror and fear. As constant pain colors every aspect of life for those who suffer it. Unfortunately, I know this all too well. Several years ago, I was diagnosed with progressive rheumatoid arthritis, a condition characterized by inflammation and relentless pain. In the time since, I've tried to read anything I could get my hands on that might offer some advice about how to exist and be a person in the face of extreme pain. But writing on pain often looks to what pain might represent rather than the fundamental reality of painful embodiment and existence. Within Christina's book, however, I found a reckoning with pain, one that captures the terror of pain in a multitude of forms, one that acknowledges the reality of living a life in pain. Christina writes of pain as a constant, as the intense burning sensation of nerves that feel akin to electric shocks, as the faint echo of a coming neurological storm, as the desperate need for relief. She writes of pain as an untenable reality and as a future threat. It is perhaps that last description that is the most terrifying to me, as I recognize it all too well. When Christina writes, quote, "Most of the time, pain only seeps through the narcotic and other chemical barrier sent against it, yet it can feel terrifying, not necessarily in the moment, but as a faded repetition," end quote. This sense of terror strikes right to the heart of living with severe pain, because even if pain is absent or bearable in the immediate moment, you know when one lives with chronic pain, you know all the flavors and the colors and the permutations, and you know that the unbearable kind lurks right around the corner. It will be only a matter of time, hours, minutes, an entire day. How much time will you get? Who can say? Until it returns. The return is the worst, a fresh lash on the scarred back. But the worst is not the pain itself. The worst is that it always returns. The worst is that it fluctuates, offering brief moments of peace before beginning its eternal onslaught yet again. And of course, as Christina reminds us, pain infects all aspects of our life. The bleak loneliness of pain is a constant companion, as pain refuses to be adequately described. It cannot be fully represented, it cannot be fully shared. Pain quite literally separates the individual in pain from other people. In a culture that shies away from the implications of bodily vulnerability, pain is understood to be a private matter, something that happens to an individual in their home, alone, to be dealt with away from the gaze of others. The loneliness of pain is the dark side of every pain-filled moment. No one can cheer us along as we fight our own flesh and nerves and bones, as we endure the unendurable. There are no parades after a good fight with pain. No medals to be given for those who suffer the most valiantly. Pain is silence, obfuscated, and covered with polite lies. Yet in this book, Christina demands we see pain, that we tarry with it, and understand the terror of it. She refuses the progress narrative of the noble cripple. There are no miracles to be had here, no perky optimism to take away the sting of reality's blow. But even for those of us who do not live lives of painful embodiment, understanding pain and bodily deterioration is still crucial. Christina reminds us that our bodies have and are a history. Likewise, they are also our future. We age, droop and wrinkle, our bodies lose strength, and our minds become forgetful. The pain and indignities of old age await us all. And perhaps through this book, Christina offers us a guide through which to come to terms with this eventuality. As she writes, quote, I am no longer what I once was, yet come to think of it, neither are you. All of us who live on are not what we were, but are becoming, always becoming.
Hi, everybody. In discussing tonight's program, I was talking to Janet, and she encouraged me that it was fine to be personal or personal-ish, and that is probably what I'm going to do, because I'm, like many of you here tonight, honored to count Christina as one of my dearest friends. It's also true that I have had the honor of appearing in this book's pages, which is really great, and I've also had the chance to read it several times in draft on its journey to becoming the truly momentous book, which I'm sure you're all gathering, if you don't know already, work that it is today. I am going to also talk primarily from the attitude as a fellow writer and a fellow autobiographical writer, rather than in any academic or theoretical way. There are so many things about this event tonight and that are staggering to me and staggeringly happy-making. The first is the very existence of this book, which, although it's not on that table back there, it shall be in about a year, which is a masterpiece and a miracle, and which I have no doubt will be foundational in so many distinct and overlapping fields. The second thing is that I, too, was a former student of Christina's, and when I met Christina in the early 90s, when I was an undergraduate at Wesleyan, and she was advising my thesis about the notion of confession in Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton by way of Foucault, as we did then and now. Anyway, if you told me then that, you know, fast forward, I don't know, 1, 2 decades, wherever we are, that Christina would be one day writing something you could call a memoir, and we would be celebrating it, I would simply not have believed you. I believe that Christina, she might correct me, but I believe she took on me and my confessional project in spite of my subject matter, not because of it. I like to think this is because she could tell I was so smart and so serious, but honestly, I think it was more of a gamble or a forced card or something. But in any event, she made it clear, never in a rude way from the get-go, that she had no substantive interest in the kind of autobiographical inquiry that riveted me, and which has continued to rivet me over the years. But I wanted her as my advisor so badly that I was willing to risk whatever mild humiliation I felt about my interest in the so-called personal. So while the egoic temptation at this moment is to feel vindicated by the fact that we're here at this event, we're going to do this memoir. No. And to retroactively erase whatever residual shame I might have then harbored or still harbor about my interests. The more interesting avenue, clearly, is to examine what Christina's contributions to the field are now, because they are, unsurprisingly, to I'm sure everyone in this room, profound. In the opening pages of her book, which we just heard a little bit about in the passage introducing about VAL programs, what she wittily calls the fundamentals of the fundament, Christina writes, and you just heard this, "I have no wish to embarrass you or mortify myself, but I do believe that living in extremis can clarify what is often obscure, in this case, the fragility of our beautiful bodies and the dependency of all human being." It's clear on the one hand that Christina's accident forced upon her a certain living in extremis which she would never have chosen, and which pushed her toward this project and this clarity. The extremity of her condition and her suffering undeniably give her book much of its urgency, authority, importance, and intensity. But it's also true that her success in the book at clarifying what is often obscure and focusing on the fragility of our beautiful bodies and the dependency of all human being depends upon talents that Christina has always had: writerly exactness and amplitude, intellectual and political reach, a teacherly ease in explaining difficult and unfamiliar concepts, an altogether uncommon emotional acuity, an earned and learned insight into the human predicament or just human predicaments, and a deep abiding commitment to questions of care, interdependency, justice, queerness, the non-normative, materiality, and vulnerability. The achievement of A Body Undone stems in part from its conjoining of these long-standing capacities of Christina's with extraordinary circumstance. In the field of autobiography, there's an annoying truism, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, that memoirs are either written by nobodies who have made their ordinary lives seem extraordinary via the act of writing, or they're written by somebodies with a great story to tell. Within this logic, you could say Christina's book is amazing because it's both. It's an extraordinary tale told in an extraordinary fashion, and there would be some truth there. But the field of autobiographical writing that I personally care about most does not traffic with such distinctions, which are always, of course, determined by power relations, and it's no accident that Frederick Douglass and Thomas Jefferson get trotted out a lot as the oft-cited examples of those two modalities. But there are so many crucial alternative genealogies to the power-soaked, tone-deaf ones on offer from the mainstream about memoir. And I see Christina's contribution here as part of a genealogy, of many different genealogies, but the one I'm just noting right now is the one that has labored relentlessly to bring together lived bodily experience, extremity or outsiderness, and literary intellectual quest. And I'm thinking of writers like Hervé Goubert, James Baldwin, Bruce Benderson, Patricia Williams, Edouard Levé, Violette Leduc, Claudia Rankine, Paul Preciado, and so many others. Works by these writers often let the reader know what it feels like. Well, I was going to say what it feels like to be on the inside of another's skin, but I actually think that's a pernicious fiction. But they at least allow for some form of visceral engagement or touching, which I haven't yet found the right word or image for, but I'm listening to my comrades here find them, and it's very instructive to me. And A Body Undone has moved me closer toward being able to articulate what that visceral touching or engagement might be about. I think part of it has to do with the power of address. And in A Body Undone, this power of address is personal, radiating, and high stakes. She writes, "Now I need you to know from the inside, as it were, how it feels to be so radically changed. If I can show you, perhaps I will be able to see, too. I see no other way to go on. How else will I understand? How will you?" She writes so we might understand something about her, and also so that she might understand something about herself. But our engagement with this process as readers, in turn, will tell us something about reflexive or enmeshed understanding itself. Maybe it will even tell us, as you were just saying so wisely, how we too will go on or not. All too often, Christina writes, I feel as if I'm living in another world, a dark realm overshadowed by the life-threatening accident that did not kill me, but obliterated the life I had been living. This dark realm is, as she explains, the realm of a horror story, one she is not just writing, but also living. The reader's not living in that dark realm with her. That much is clear. This is decidedly not a book that we can stand before and say blithely, I feel your pain. We do not. Yet by sharing in this third thing she's made between us, this living document, and its sharp, generous sketch of this other realm, a transaction takes place. I would go so far to say this transaction is beyond empathy, or is more important than empathy. It's phenomenological, and that it invites us to rethink and refeel the boundaries by which we create and experience individual selves. As Christina well knows, not only do our bodies come into being via relation with others, but also when you go to write about yourself, you immediately, and to write about oneself is to write about other people, other selves. And I've been in this business for long enough to know, to have heard many different renditions of this imbrication, which is very more often than not framed negatively. The writers using others, the writers exploiting personal experience for literary record. Autobiographical writing is by definition an act of betrayal. It's several acts of betrayal, as the case may be. The autobiographical writer is necessarily a narcissist, an onanist, an exhibitionist, and so on and so forth. But one of the great gifts of this book that I want to tell you about is the way that it foregrounds a completely other and often quite underappreciated mode of relation that such writing might forge with other people or between people. And this is where I'm going to get personal and perhaps narcissistic and talk about what Christina has written about me in this book. Recounting her time in the hospital for special care, she writes, waking in a haze of pain and confusion, I would find Maggie quietly beside the bed, watching over me, and I'm not going to lose it, but I might a little bit. Okay. Watching over me, waiting, sometimes writing in a spiral-bound notebook. I was not surprised. Language had always been for her the most likely medium for addressing the imponderable. the most likely medium for addressing the imponderable. No one has ever reflected my own writing practice back to me so accurately and with so much love and compassion and insight. And think about it, all this compassion and insight emanating from Christina's time in a place she can only describe as hell. Later, in talking about the poems I wrote about her time in the hospital, which I published with her exceedingly generous blessing, she says, "My friend offered her open, loving proximity, the gift of her presence. I fell asleep and awoke, and she was still with me. Maggie's poems were a second gift to me, for they represent to me my life as another saw it in those first months after my injury. The poems recall a time that left a deep, confused, and overwhelmingly painful impress on me and suspend my life in the richness of poetic language." Again, just imagine. The poems bear witness to a deep, confused, and overwhelmingly painful time, and she calls them a gift. I can safely say no one has ever called my representation of them in writing a gift. Ever. When I read my partner this passage, which was likely, I admit, a tacit rebuke to him for bristling he's done at my representation of him in writing. So I'm right there with you, Jen. He pointed out that Christina and I have a particularly harmonious relationship on this account, and that since she and I both love and respect each other so much as friends, it makes sense we would have an easier time of it. I saw this point, but actually I disagreed. I do not think that writing and publishing accounts of someone's radically injured and changed body or bearing witness to someone's profound, bottomless grief is naturally harmonious or uncharged territory. I feel quite certain that the positivity and generosity and understanding and gratitude Christina has offered toward my representations of her, which continue in my forthcoming book, and the leather pants, she is an indefatigable muse, derived from a different source altogether, which is Christina's singular, radical capacity to recognize and accept both the harmonious and disharmonious aspects of relation, and to recognize and accept the richness of language, be it poetic or otherwise, as a completely imperfect and also glorious vital means by which we come into and negotiate relation, by which we are here in this suspension together. For that and for more, I will be forever grateful.
For 14 years, I was Christina's colleague at Wesleyan, and she was kind enough to share some of the beginning drafts with me some years ago. And to see those starts ripen into this extraordinary book is a testimony to many things, but mostly Christina's indomitable spirit, her brilliance and strength, and I guess what I'm going to say is love. After a hard day of integrating grade school in Central Ohio, I looked forward to dusk when a Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train would fly by on tracks about 100 yards away from my house. On many days, I longed to be on that train, seated in the diner with its linen tablecloths, silver service, and good food. Had I been lucky, the next day I might have found myself looking out the window around Huntington, Pennsylvania, looking at the intense play of some younger white children. Two of them might have been Tina and Jeff, and I would have changed places with them in a heartbeat. Had the train stopped, I would have seen Christina's physical courage and prowess, her intensity of purpose, and her competitive spirit, especially in play, her blondness, her embodiment of what American girls were supposed to look like, even if her play was rather tomboyish. I remember when the dreaded email with a single name in the subject line appeared on my computer screen, like the bulletins that would interrupt television watching in the 50s and 60s with some dreadful news. I opened it quickly and remembered being very scared, my stomach dropping in the nanoseconds it took for the message to appear on the screen. This bulletin said that Christina had been very seriously injured in a bicycle accident. Little did any of us reading that message know just how serious was. Reading Body Undone underscores in ways that no imagination could have conceived of on the evening of October 1st or the morning of October 2nd, 2003, just how ghastly her injuries were, just how staggeringly heroic Christina's response to them would be, or just how her account of the accident in this manuscript is a testimony to possibility, to the wonder and the courage of a singular human being. In The Astonishing World, Barbara Grizzuti Harrison writes, "While there may be no such thing as writing that is not personal, there is writing that is self-indulgent and writing that is not self-indulgent. There is writing about the self that elevates and stops at the self and loves the self unbecomingly. And on the other hand, there are writers who go in to the core in order to move out to the things of this world which love calls us back to, if we listen. The ultimate reality is experienced and understood in the deepest center of the writer, the spiritual core. That is where the meaningful connections are made." Body Undone takes us to Christina's core as we bear witness to her brave rebirth necessitated by her gruesome trauma. I'm seeking a metaphor, but no metaphor is available to make Christina's story understandable at the I know what you mean level. There is no I know what you mean level. But sometimes literature can help, and I find that African American writers frequently come the closest for me. At the end of the opening chapter of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie, our iconic protagonist, returns to the all-black town of Eatonville, Florida, having been away for over a year. Walking past her porch-sitting neighbors whose long-standing jealousy over her looks, her money, and her status in the community reveals itself in vicious undertone and insinuation, Janie reaches her empty house. She has arrived wearing overalls, carrying no luggage, and without the man, Tea Cake, with whom she left town. After 2 dreadful marriages to men appropriately named Killix and Starks, Janie had found an equal in Tea Cake. Their love for each other, so symbiotic and easy, was too threatening to matrimonial hierarchies of male dominance. Humans and nature, the latter in the form of a hurricane and a dog, seemed to conspire to end the bliss Janie and Tea Cake enjoyed. Saving Janie from the flood, Tea Cake was bitten by a fierce dog whom we later learned was rabid. Janie saves her own life by shooting Tea Cake, who had attacked her in his own rabid frenzy. After having been exonerated from charges that she murdered him, she returns home. As she enters her house, her dear friend Phoebe welcomes Janie back, bringing her food. The nasty porch sitters want to know the story, but refuse to ask Janie. So Janie says to Phoebe, if they, the other neighbors, wants to see and know, why don't they come kiss and be kissed? I could then sit down and tell them things. I've been a delegate to the big associations of life, Yessa, the Grand Lodge, the big convention of livings, just where I've been this year and a half since y'all ain't seen me. It's been the big association of life, not of disaster, sorrow, or loss. Janie then begins to recount to Phoebe the story of how she arrived home, starting with her childhood. Hers is an enduring story that millions of readers consider a literary tour de force, politically significant and personally empowering in our vexed journey toward gender and racial equality and freedom. The Janie at the end of Their Eyes Were Watching God has been altered by time and experience, by heartache and loss, but it is only in the details that she has changed. The life she lived brought out what was already in her. We are Christina's Phoebe, and we encounter Christina's journey to the big association of life in a story as profound an examination of the meanings of true grit, intellectual power, and mostly love that a reader is liable to find anywhere. No one could be prepared for the grievous injuries Christina sustained in the accident. Had she worked on it every day of her life, she could not have prepared for it. But the person who emerges in Body Undone owns the rare physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual reserves that helped her survive, and the reader discovers that through Christina's ability to render, often lyrically, the depth and meaning for the reader, it is the beauty in the beast of the injury. The Body Undone in the accident was uncommon. Playing and fighting with her brother Jeff gave Christina a level of physical courage the majority of women of her generation lacked. While I may know that Christina was the strongest and fittest person in Wesleyan's English department, the physical attributes that emerge in Body Undone are emblematic of all of Christina: balanced, confident, solid, smooth, and easy. She may have named her dog Babe, but Christina is a babe, as my mother noted by the tone of her "who's the blonde?" question after Christina helped her negotiate a curb. Christina's presence was always noteworthy. The body built in Pennsylvania was transgressive, competitive, attractive, enjoyable, and as strong as the iron ore that helped build the state. It turns out that her spiritual and emotional conditioning was at least as strong as the physical. The Church of the Brethren is a Christian denomination that stresses action over creed. It is a church that takes quite seriously the question, what would Jesus do? Christina left the church years ago, and it is clear from Body Undone that her mother's faith is not hers. Christina made no covenant with God like the one her mother made at age 18 to give up all her plans to follow the will of God. But Body Undone contains example upon example of just how much the ethics of the theology of the Church of the Brethren formed Christina's personal philosophy and her way of being. Those ethics explain how this memoir can exist without one maudlin line in it, and how it is void of the narcissism and self-indulgence that so annoyed Grizzudi Harrison and that plagues our society. After finishing her book, I thought about that wonderful savant David Rakoff, who said in the face of his terminal cancer, "You can't win all the contests and then lose one and say, why am I not winning this contest as well? It's random." So truthfully, again, do I wish it weren't me? Absolutely. I still can't make the logistic step to thinking there's a reason why it shouldn't be me. I'm reminded of this because Christina's book is in the same spirit. When I imagined changing places with Christina, it was about having access to her white privilege, and all that, to me, attended it. Confidence, even in hostile waters, comfort in her queerness, and levels of acceptance still unimaginable to me. What partially emerges from Body Undone is the story of upbringing that insisted that she understand what white privilege means. The story is still evolving. It's not completely retrospective, but when she writes of Donna, her certified nursing assistant, Christina realizes that there is really no way to make the help an equal, given the economic realities facing all of the members involved. But she tells us that she and Donna love each other, and doubtless they do, with a bond precious and special, somehow shorn, as much as it seems humanly possible, of the paternalism and condescension rife when black serves white. Christina insists that the notion that disability leads to profound insight or higher understanding is fundamentally bunk. I can believe it because on one level it tolerates laziness in the abled. The nature of her narrative resists the more familiar one that says, "This dreadful thing happened to me, but I'm okay." Christina interjects and, "Excuse me, but no." Yet the fact that Body Undone is filled with profound insight and higher understanding is evidence of what already was in place on the morning of October 1st, 2003. Disability can be the cause of a deliberate, sometimes agonizing reappraisal of the self, yet the process of writing can help tame the demons as it educates the self and the reader. Early in the text, she writes, "I started writing this book to create something from an otherwise confounded life. Only through writing have I arrived at the life I now lead, the body I now am." And a bit later she says, "My hope is to offer a phenomenologically rich, emotionally resonant, intellectually fortified account of my life and the impairments with which I live. What the reader witnesses in Body Undone is the creation of a new life from a memory of an older one using only words. The miracle of words." If I were reading Body Undone without knowing its author, I would say that it is an amazing discourse on the meaning of love. Adversity may not have created profundity, but it was the catalyst for a revelation of a person whose life of love is uncommon and wonderful. Although she denies it, the book is profound. Christina has what I call the big love. Oh, how rare it is to find. As Janie says to Phoebe, "Love is like the sea. It's a moving thing, but still in all, it takes its shape from the shores it meets, and it's different with every shore." The shore she met after the accident is not the one she wanted, but it is through the memory and the persistence of her love that moves her as close as she possibly can to an appreciation of her new life. Christina may have left the Church of the Brethren, but the totality of the engagement the faith asked of its adherents is recognizable in the breadth and depth of Christina's love. Before the accident, she tells us that she was a deeply happy woman who enjoyed an enviable full body and soul, sex-positive life with her lover, Janet. There were dogs, her athleticism, the dressing up for New York, motorcycle and bicycle rides, lectures, glasses of scotch and bourbon, and the complex and rich relationship with her brother Jeff with its nearly unspeakable ironies. There's the intellectual powerhouse and teacher, Christina, too, whose voice resonates throughout this manuscript, elucidating the ineluctable truths of her quadriplegia. All of these habits of body and mind, of engaging the world profoundly and passionately, began in the worshiping and playing fields of Huntingdon. This was the big association of life. In Toni Morrison's Paradise, the reader is treated to one of the many sermons we find in her fiction. This time the lesson is that God truly is love. The Reverend Senior Pulliam says, "Love is not a gift, it is a diploma conferring certain privileges, the privilege of expressing love and the privilege of receiving it. How do you know you've graduated? You don't. What you do know is that you are human and therefore educable, and therefore capable of learning how to learn." Christina graduated with honors. I do not believe that anything but the ability to love deeply could have carried Christina to this place, to this salon, despite the pain, the fear, the horror of her circumstances. She writes, "I can't always comprehend what it is to live as I do now, yet I live on." That is the mystery and miracle of love. At the end of Hurston's novel, Phoebe explains, "Lord, I done growed 10 feet higher from just listening to you, Janie." Such is the power of words to elevate and transform the reader. Hurston wore 3 hats. She was an anthropologist who worked with Franz Boas, she was a folklorist and singer, and she was a writer. Part of her literary work merged all 3 into one hat. Their eyes were watching God celebrated a disappearing oral tradition of storytelling, and the languages of the novel celebrate the lyricism, inventiveness, and power of the word spoken by Black Southerners to each other. It was, as Skip Gates calls it, a speakerly text. Open any page of Body Undone, and you will hear Christina's voice conversing with you as she recounts the past, the present, and her concerns about the future. Hers is a speakerly text too, and as such she has preserved for herself and for us through words the memory of a life she can no longer live. Yet, as she reminds us, she lives on, thank goodness, having spent more than a decade creating a new life, vexed, unbearable as it may be at times, but animated by the courage, grace, downright cussedness, and love of a brilliant and unbelievably fabulous human being.
Are we or are we not our bodies? It is a central tenet of phenomenology that having a body is central to our personhood, and that the human body is never simply a matter of being, but is always a process of becoming. Yet that phenomenological truism often figures becoming as a process of acquisition, of gain, the increase of skills and capacities which, as they widen, give us greater reach toward others and toward the world. What happens when our becoming is a matter of diminishment rather than gain? In her moving and unsparing memoir, Christina Crosby asks what it means to live on after an accident that robs her not just of her body, but her embodiment, her way of being in herself and the world. Her account has everything to do with the particularity of her injury and its consequences, but also radiates with a significance beyond that. All of us who live in and as bodies will undergo a becoming that is also an undoing as we age and experience the diminishment of our capacities. Phenomenology insists that our bodies are not something that we have, but rather something that we are. our inescapable vantage point, the material means by which the world is brought to us and we are brought into it. This emphasis on the centrality of bodily life to human being functions as a corrective to the understanding, ubiquitous in Western thought, that it is mind or soul or Geist or some equally immaterial essence in which our personhood inheres, that body is merely the physical trapping in which our spirit is caged. Christina responds to this tired yet ubiquitous trope, the body as the indispensable but inessential material form in which the divine spark of our being is housed, by inverting that relation. After the accident, she becomes unhoused. Quote, anything can happen at any moment, a trance of glitter, a rush of injury, and we must live with one another and our unhoused selves, unquote. Ourselves can become unhoused not by becoming free of the body, but paradoxically by becoming more firmly fixed to it. After the accident, Christina is unable to fade her body out of her consciousness as a locus of attention. She can no longer inhabit it or her world freely and unthinkingly. Because of constant pain, her body is almost constantly present to her sensorium and to her consciousness, and in that, it stops housing her as it once did. She is unhoused because she cannot be in her body, and she is unhoused because she is too much in her body. This relationship to our own bodies, as subtle and complex and demanding as any relation we have with other people, is one that language struggles to capture. It is hard to describe. As Christina puts it, quote, how am I to represent this complex embodied figure? My skin is an organ of sense that runs imperceptibly from inside my body to the outside, or from outside to inside, which defeats the idea that I'm living in my body. There's no preposition adequate to representing the position of mind to body, since they are simultaneously one and the same and clearly distinct. Thinking my body, I am thinking in my body, as my body, through my body, of my body, about my body, and I'm oriented around my body. I'm beside myself, unquote. This work of finding her new body is not only bodily work, it is the work of braiding her body together through thinking, through understanding, through remembering, and through language. Language, in fact, emerges here as a kind of bodily auxiliary, I would argue, something that is not an organic part of the body, but becomes so through its proximity to the body with repeated use. The articulation of this relation through language is as important to Christina's recovery as any other kind of rehabilitative work. Quote, whatever chance I have at a good life, and this is a passage that Maggie read also, in all senses of that phrase depends on my openness to the undoing wrought by spinal cord injury, because there is no return to an earlier life. I know that the life I live now depends on my day-to-day relation with others as it did before, but to an incalculably greater extent. Now I need you to know, from the inside as it were, how it feels to be so radically changed. If I can show you, perhaps I'll be able to see too. The intricacies of body-mind interactions defy certainties and confound representation, but I see no other way to go on. How else will I understand? How will you? Christina points to this impossible desire that motivates her writing, trying to show us what she cannot possibly show us, to help us feel from the inside what she feels from the inside. That is part of the extraordinary intimacy of this book, that we are invited to feel, along with Christina, from her inside, a feeling at a distance that her lucid and unsparing prose renders almost possible. The intricacy of this nearly possible feeling with is compounded by complexity. She's trying to convey to us the phenomenological particularity of her painful embodiment, a particularity that she herself cannot perhaps entirely compass without feeling as if we can somehow know it too. Quote, "If I can show you, perhaps I'll be able to see." The tactile and the visual, too, find their intimate proximity through language. It is tricky, this intimacy, and requires a constant vigilance, like everything else, because the solution is not simply more telling. As Christina explains, she stops telling everyone except her therapist about her constant pain because of the ways in which such telling, as she puts it, corrodes social bonds. Like her relationship to her body, her relationship to pain is one for which no single preposition will suffice. Crosby lives on after great pain, but also with it, in it, inside it, through it, and sometimes underneath it. The task of living becomes the task of bearing that pain. She writes, quoting Maggie Nelson's poetic engagement with her condition, "Simply live with." It is this living with that was, to my mind, the most astonishing in the many, many astonishing things in this book. That injunction, "simply live with," is both reflexive and relational. Simply live with it, the pain, the devastations of the body, that which cannot be changed by wanting it not to be so, that which does not give way to the will. Christina must live with it, as must those with whom she lives, those she loves, those who love her. The loss of able-bodied embodiment, she explains, teaches her something about the necessity of relations with others, a necessity that able-bodiedness often allows us to overlook. Simply live with also points to the ways in which Christina's relational life is radically changed after the accident. Ease of embodiment affords a person a kind of self-sufficiency that is not reducible to its effects on the self. Loss of that ease means that her relationship to every aspect of her life is changed, including her most intimate ones, a lover whose touch she can no longer fully feel, a dog who cannot become reconciled with her bodily auxiliary, her wheelchair. So this living with is necessary, but it is not all that is necessary. If we are our bodies, Christina is attentive to the temporal and ontological strangeness of that assertion. We are our bodies, but part of that being is anchored in the bodies that we used to be but no longer are. Living without is the shadowy twin to living with. As Christina says, she finds it painful but also crucial to her sense of self that she retain her connection to what has been lost, sensations, perceptions, formations. That keeping faith with her lost past is just as crucial for her sense of self as acknowledging that it will never again be her present. Living with what no longer is, a living that can never be done simply. It is this crafting and persisting into a livable life, which is not the same as redemption or repair, that Christina describes so beautifully. As she writes, quoting Merleau-Ponty, "No one is saved, and no one is totally lost."